For a while now, I've been drawing engines that appear in single illustrations in the Railway series, discussing them and giving them personalities in the process. But there are some engines created by Wilbert Awdry and his son Christopher that never even made it into the books whatsoever. No background cameo or passing mention, nothing at all. All the information we know about them comes in the form of interviews, lectures, supplementary material or model railway layouts. Earlier in the year I covered the mystery engines of the Mid-Sodor Railway, which fall into this category, but the North Western Railway has its own fair share of unseen engines as well, and today we're going to take a look at them. It's drawing time. This character was created by the Reverend Awdry during the 1970s. By this point he had stopped writing books, and so Bloomer never appeared in the series. We do, however, know exactly what he looked like because Awdry made a model of him for use on his Farquhar layout. The story goes that after being withdrawn from service on the London and North Western Railway, Bloomer was bought by the Portpatrick and Wigtonshire Railway and spent many years working the line before he was withdrawn from service and presumed scrapped. However, the Fat Controller eventually found him in an old shed in Wigtonshire in the early 1970s and had him overhauled at Crovan's Gate Works. Bloomer was restored to working order by 1975, in time to take part in the Shildon Cavalcade to celebrate 150 years since the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the first public railway in the world to use steam engines. Since then, Bloomer has been brought out of retirement now and then to haul enthusiast specials, usually on Thomas's branch line. A few years back I drew an illustration of Bloomer. I was inspired by another Thomas fan artist called Will Dawson Books, and much like his illustrations I also added a page of text as if it were an excerpt from a Railway series story. In the text I referred to Bloomer as female as his gender wasn't widely known at the time. I also made Bloomer female due to the general lack of female engines in the Railway series, but also because of this image from Tim Dunn's reading of the History of Sodor lecture. To me, it conjured up the image of a slightly witchy old woman, which I thought was a fun idea for an engine. To be fair, I still do, but for the sake of accuracy I've decided to keep Bloomer as a male engine for this video. Sometimes Bloomer finds the enthusiast specials to be a bit overwhelming, with everyone pushing and shoving to get a good view of him and take plenty of photos. However, he also considers it to be worth it in order to stretch his wheels and get to have conversations with the Farquhar engines. Toby is the engine he gets on with the most. They often exchange stories about their old lines, and Bloomer is one of the few engines who can make Toby feel young again. Bloomer is older than Toby by some 60 odd years after all. In fact, Bloomer is the oldest engine on the Island of Sodor, even older than Neil. Going back to how Bloomer can easily get overwhelmed, perhaps there's story potential there. His determination to get a good job done goes awry when the sheer volume of enthusiasts, fans and photographers overwhelm him so much that he can't pull the train, leading him to be sent back to his resting place whilst another heritage engine pulls the train for him instead. Maybe Toby could pay a visit to him and tell him the methods he uses to stay calm during hectic scenarios. Bloomer could then return for another rail tour and put on his best performance yet. And, with all that said, here is the finished picture. Barry the Rescue Engine was a book that Christopher Awdry wrote, but was rejected by the publishers and the test audiences because they wanted more stories about Thomas. By this point, the TV series was already airing and proving very popular, and so the publishers were wary of a book that focused largely on a new engine that wasn't present in the show. Barry is a character who is basically in limbo. The original drafts for his stories are apparently completely lost, but Christopher Awdry can't write or publish new stories featuring Barry because, whilst his book was rejected, he is still legally part of the Railway series and thus is owned by Mattel, so any official content involving the engine is unlikely. Barry is so named because of a scrapyard on Barry Island in South Wales. In real life, many engines were purchased from this scrapyard by enthusiasts and preservationists, who would then restore the engines to working order to run on heritage railways. The story of Barry the engine was inspired by these real-life stories. Long-time fans of the channel may remember that this is not the first time I've featured Barry in a video. In 2009, I created a trains video that features Barry in the spotlight, and he looks like this. He is a completely different design from how we know Barry was meant to look, as this was a sort of mixture between Barry and a certain other unseen character which we'll later get to, based on an old rumour that they were one and the same. I wouldn't be surprised if said rumour was already debunked by the time my video came out, but I was kinda simple like that. My old version of Barry was red with blue lining, which again stems from an old rumour I recall doing the rounds claiming that this was Barry's colour scheme. My recollection is that it was alleged to have been confirmed by a member of the Awdry family, possibly Hilary Fortnum. I can't find any information confirming this, so it's probably not true. We've known for a while that Barry was based on a British Railway Standard Class 2, although for a long time it was thought that he was the tender engine version of the class, until fairly recently when we got confirmation that he was in fact a tank engine. A lot of people prefer Barry as a tender engine, and whilst I understand why, I personally don't agree. Whilst I get that the Class 2 tank is almost indistinguishable from Arthur, and thus could be considered a mere copy, in the context of the Railway series it makes sense to introduce a larger tank engine when the North Western Railway's biggest tank engine up to this point was an 060. Meanwhile, we already have plenty of medium-sized tender engines like James, Edward, Donald and Douglas. I've drawn Barry on the Norrumby branch line. If you've seen my interpretation of how Arthur could work in the Railway series, you might know where I'm going with this. My idea is that Arthur's visit to the Norrumby line was something of a trial run, as the Fat Controller knew where he could get a similar engine. By the time Arthur had returned to the mainland, the Fat Controller was already making arrangements to purchase Barry, who operated the Norrumby branch alongside a diesel engine from the mainland. And so, here is the finished drawing. The final engine we're going to be looking at is Walter. No, not that Walter. Alright, now you're just being silly. Walter is the engine I alluded to in the previous part. He is a Hunslet austerity saddle tank engine who was purchased with the intention of putting him in charge of the Harwick branch line. Whilst this video is about characters never mentioned or seen in the books, technically Walter has been mentioned, albeit not by name. In Wilbert the Forest engine, the Fat Controller says he knows where he can get another engine like Wilbert. For over 30 years, nothing was known about Walter, but we now know what his name was and where he was intended to work. I'm depicting Walter at a rough guess at what Harwick Station may have looked like. Walter was purchased by the North Western Railway sometime between 1993 and 2020. Given that working steam was very much a thing of the past by this point, it can be assumed that Walter originally belonged to a heritage railway or centre before becoming NWR property. It's hard to know what exact engine he may have been. I know there are other YouTubers who could do a better job deducing him than I could, although I wouldn't be surprised if Walter was actually an engine that wasn't preserved in real life, but was preserved in the Railway series timeline. Possibly he'd be an engine that was scrapped in real life, or maybe a fictional addition to the class. My thinking is that Walter's main experience with pulling passengers was on a small heritage line somewhere on the mainland. Because people came to his line to enjoy themselves, they were always happy to see him, and his workload was shared with a number of other engines, preventing him from getting overworked. When he becomes the main engine of the Harwick branch line, he's in for a bit of a shock. Now his passengers aren't there to enjoy themselves, they just want to get from point A to point B. This would be fine on its own, but there's another group of people that Walter has to contend with: NIMBYs. For decades, Harwick was a getaway spot for Sodor locals who wanted to avoid tourists, since for the longest time there was no rail connection. Now that there is a rail connection, many of the locals are angry, which hasn't exactly made Walter feel welcome. Eventually, Walter learns that some people can't be reasoned with and just want to be angry. Meanwhile, his regular passengers notice that Walter is feeling down, and they do everything they can to make Walter feel at home on his new line. If you're wondering why Thomas is so far away from his branch line, check the video I made in which I worked Stanley into the Railway series canon. To make a long story short, Thomas was helping to build the Harwick extension and Stanley came in to do his regular jobs. Thomas related to Walter's struggle, as the NIMBYs gave him abuse as well whilst he was helping to build the line. He made sure to take none of what they said to heart and urged Walter to do the same. But with that said and done, here is the completed image. And there we are, 3 engines created by the Awdrys, but never written or illustrated in the books. It was interesting looking back at these engines who had and still have an air of mystery about them, even if strides have been taken to demystify them in more recent times. I hope you enjoyed my look at these characters as well, and if you did, be sure to subscribe to see what I've got in store for next time.